Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Headline Geopolitics. I'm your host, José Niño. On today's show, I'm joined by one of the most diligent and insightful voices, in my view, on foreign policy matters, Kyle Anzalone, who's the news editor of the Libertarian Institute and the opinion editor at Antiwar.com. He also co-hosts Conflicts of Interest, and he's constantly busy putting out high quality content from a principled non-interventionist perspective. Kyle, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, Jose, happy to be here. I love the show intro. That was really cool.
Yeah, we're definitely starting off with a bang. So, yeah, let's get right into it. Donald Trump campaigned throughout all the election cycles that he's been involved in as a so-called peace and realist candidate, especially with regards to the Russo-Ukrainian war, which he promised would end within 24 hours, and that has not come to pass as of now. What is your general assessment of Trump's second term thus far?
Yeah, so Jose, there was a lot of debate, I'm sure in the wider libertarian community that you were aware of whether or not to support Trump in his second term. And the reason I couldn't get on board with it is just looking back at his first term. And I thought that his second term would look a lot like his first term. And just for the top, I just wanted to say that at the front, because I think that's going to really be a large part of my analysis today is Trump is who he was 4 or 8 years ago. He's the same man. He's doing the same things. And so look at Trump's first administration. What was the result of his actual Russia policy? Sure, he sat down and he talked to Vladimir Putin. He also put extensive sanctions on Russia. He had expelled dozens of Russian diplomats from the U.S. And most importantly, he started sending lethal arms to Ukraine. And so for all of Trump's talk coming into office the first time around that he was going to get along better with Russia, he didn't do it. And we're seeing the same thing this time around. He was saying he's going to even end the war before he takes office at one point in time.
Yeah.
Then he says he's going to do in 24 hours, which, the president says everybody knew that was bluster. And you could say, okay, you make a fair point there. What he was really saying, it was going to be on the top of his agenda and was going to be one of the first issues that he solved. And clearly he hasn't been able to do that. The president himself has admitted that he's frustrated. Sources around him have said that he's frustrated and has expressed frustration at times with both Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The problem, I think the fundamental problem with Donald Trump is whether it's, at this point, maybe his advanced age and his mental fitness or just his overall attention span. He isn't able to commit and understand geopolitical issues deeply enough and understand how geopolitical issues are resolved. Peter Van Buren does a really good job, a former State Department employee. He's a whistleblower, was deeply involved in the reconstruction effort after the Iraq War. And one of the things that he's explained time and time again, and it's really sunk in for me, is that, and others have explained this as well, like Charles Freeman, but geopolitics, it's not going to be resolved through tweets or phone calls between Trump and Putin. The first thing you have are working level talks, then you have intermediate level talks, and then you have higher level talks before you basically hammer out an agreement before the leaders of two countries meet and actually sign that agreement, right? Marco Rubio was recently talking about how for a memo to get on his desk, it required the authorization of 40 people at the State Department. And so these big bureaucracies move very slowly. And so the idea that he was going to get it done quickly just didn't work. And when Trump, it doesn't happen quickly, Trump seems to get frustrated quickly, but also he seems to be very easily worn down by the pro-war propagandist. And so whenever, say, he says, I'm going to engage with the Russians, then you have the entire mainstream media most of the Republican, the entire Democratic establishment comes out and they're berating him on this, and they're making all kinds of wild accusations about him being a Putin puppet and a fascist and all these stupid things to try to rein him in on the issue. And because the success doesn't come quickly enough, the criticisms take over in Trump's mind, and he ends up reversing course and becoming more hawkish than his predecessors. And so I think we're in the middle of that flip right now, where he comes into office talking better. He talks to Putin. He's mad at Zelensky. Right. Good. We're on the right track here. But then a deal doesn't get done. He's tired of the criticism and the hawks in his administration telling him, and apparently his wife as well, that, Putin's a bad guy. He's doing bad things. We can't allow this to happen. You can't be soft on Putin. And so now he's going along with the Lindsey Graham plan to start to tariff third countries, right? So this is going to be China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey even maybe is on the potential list there. And so they're talking about adding sanctions and tariffs on all of these countries over them continuing to do business with Russia. Trump is starting to roll out new aid packages, right? The Trump administration had continued to allow the weapons approved by Joe Biden to flow to Ukraine during his administration. And as much as I don't want to support the proxy war in Ukraine, if he was going to do that as a part of giving the Ukrainians enough leverage to hammer out a decent deal with the Russians, that kind of made sense. But it's pretty clear that's not what was going on. And so now we're at a point where the Ukrainians need more weapons or they're going to be absolutely screwed. And Trump is going to be bullied into going along with it. And when Donald Trump does something, he's not going to be, I think, as careful as the Biden administration was. And there's the report in the Financial Times about Trump telling Zelensky to make Putin feel the pain to start carrying out more deeper strikes inside of Russian territory. And so, again, Jose, I think we're at that point where not only is Trump going to continue the proxy war, he's actually going to significantly ramp up the American involvement in it compared to what Joe Biden was willing to do.
There's this one debate I've noticed in foreign policy circles that centers around like these questions. Is Trump being tricked by bad advisors, or does he just have American primacy embedded in his political psyche and the way he carries out decisions on the foreign policy stage? Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I guess I don't like using the word tricked because at least during Trump's first term, I don't think he was that stupid. Now, given some of the posts he has on Truth Social and some of the things he says, I really do wonder how cognitively fit the president is and how easy he could
wall text.
Right. I know co-host of Part of the Problem, Robbie Bernstein, would hate me bringing this up because he would talk about how America wants a new storyline with the new president, and people don't want to hear that, we're again in a position where the president's in a diminished mental capacity due to advanced stage. But when I look at Donald Trump this time around, I do see some of that far more than his first administration. And I guess, if he is duped, he's allowing himself to be duped. I wouldn't say that. I'm not trying to present as Trump is being tricked in a way to absolve him of responsibility. Yeah. But when you do, there is only so much that a human being could pay attention to. And so when you're the president of the United States, you have to rely on the information that your Secretary of State, your CIA director, your director of national intelligence, who are Tulsi Gabbard, right? That these people are bringing you correct information, accurate information. And, that's what you're basing your decisions off of, right? I spend all my time focusing on foreign policy. And so that's what I know about. I don't know about the domestic policy stuff as much. And so if I were to have real deep opinions on immigration or what the federal lending rate should be, I would have to rely on somebody else who I trust to make those decisions. And by surrounding, personnel is policy. By surrounding yourself with hawks, you're going to be led to make hawkish decisions.
That reminded me of something John Mearsheimer said in one of his interviews with Andrew Napolitano. I forget what book he cited, but he says that on average in a presidency, a president can tackle maybe 2 to 3, 4 if they're lucky, foreign policy issues like effectively, because after that the domestic policy constraints start kicking in and they just don't have enough attention to do that. So this leads to another point, because you hear a good deal of people talk about the Republican Party's new populist realignment, where people in the party are becoming more skeptical of foreign policy entanglements and the constant desire for maintaining American hegemony. But it seems that a lot of this is very rhetorical. But when it comes to actual policy outcomes, we have seen little to no change in terms of the U.S. foreign policy course. At best, it looks like it's very much like stagnant and driven mostly like stuck in a point of like inertia. Do you think the Republican Party is more or less the same, or do you think it will move in a more realist direction, but it's just going to take more time than expected?
Yeah, I mean, the reaction to the war in Ukraine, I will say, has been somewhat disappointing. I haven't seen a whole lot of pressure from the MAGA base, certainly not the establishment Republicans on Trump, to do something differently here. Now, a part of that may be that Trump hasn't had to go to Congress and ask for a major influx of aid to send to the Ukrainians, right? And there's a couple ways that Trump is, I think, going about this. One, he was just letting the weapons approved under Biden flow. And then the U.S. also had about $3.9 billion left in congressionally approved funds of money they could send to Ukraine. And so Trump's first, 4 or 5 arms packages to Ukraine, he won't need further congressional help on. And I think that prevents that from being a major debate. But once that happens, there will be a major debate. Now, they're working on a couple schemes to try to prevent this from happening. One is that they're going to say, oh, the Europeans are buying the weapons and then they're sending them to Ukraine. However, I think this really misses what should be the fundamental argument of the America Firsters, which at this point, it's not even about the Treasury. It's about the armor, right? Sure, we're at $37 trillion in debt, and sending additional billions of dollars in arms to Ukraine is unwise. However, we have 25% of the Patriot interceptors the Pentagon defense plans call for, right? Like, this should be a major concern. We depleted our stockpiles of 155 millimeter artillery shells. We've depleted our stockpiles of high armaments like the ATACMS. So that we're sending a significant amount of our arms to Ukraine, and that these stockpiles will forget years, probably decades to rebuild. They only make 500 new Patriot interceptors a year, right? They can only produce 40,000 artillery shells a month. And so, if Ukraine is burning through millions of these things, then it's going to take decades at that rate to produce enough to refill our own arms depots. And so that should be the real concern of the Americans, but it's not on Trump's radar, right? Like, it shows Trump's lack of depth of understanding of these issues, right? He thought it was terrible and he's right, that the Americans were being ripped off by our support for Ukraine in the proxy war during the Biden administration. But now that he's in office, he has to realize that the Biden administration has completely screwed America in all the weapons that they've sent overseas. And this should be a major outrage of all of us that we've depleted our arms stockpiles for the benefit of a foreign nation. But Trump just doesn't bring up that issue at all or discuss it. And so that's really disappointing. Now, it also seems that they baited him in on this natural resources and mineral deal, which I think is a total scam, where what they're saying is they're saying that they're going to create mining companies in Ukraine and then give people in the U.S. or the U.S. government have ownership of these companies. But the problem, Jose, is that if these mining companies are created for mines that end up in Russian territory, then there's never going to be seen profits by those companies. And if that company is valued at a couple $100 million, right, and then the U.S. says, okay, we have now a portion of this company that's worth $500 million, so we could send $500 million in weapons in Ukraine, we're getting totally taken advantage of there. This is an obvious fraud and an obvious scam, but I think Trump is going either doesn't know, doesn't understand, or is going to use it to send more weapons to Ukraine without having to come back to Congress. I think once he has to go to Congress to get more arms for Ukraine, that's really going to be the test of Republicans if they've moved in a different political direction when it comes to foreign policy. Now, I will say, I think we've seen in the Middle East some real pushback from Republicans that's been positive. I just don't think it's kind of come to the fore on the Ukrainian issue yet.
The question of the armament inventories and just stockpile crisis, I've noticed, has gathered a lot of steam. I used to think that this was kind of exaggerated talk, but with the Russo-Ukrainian war and then the conflict of Israel, not just like the Gaza theater, but also the 12-day air war with Iran, it's really come to the fore. It does seem that there is a legitimate crisis. And was that more or less accelerated by the constant deluge of aid to Israel, that it's gotten to the point where people in DC are debating whether we have to cut off Ukraine and shift those resources to Israel, or are they just committing to both positions, like maximalist positions of sending as much aid as possible to both countries?
Yeah, I mean, you would think that there would have to be some realization in a White House, particularly one that's interested in fighting a future war with China, which I think, Elbridge Colby kind of represents that realist faction. And he apparently is the Pentagon staffer that realized this issue. And that's the reason there was a brief pause, at least, of Patriot interceptor transfers to Ukraine, right? So the war in Gaza has, I think, largely used a different set of weapons than what the Ukrainians are in desperate need of, like the HIMARS rockets. Israelis are using tank shells and they're using aerial dropped bombs, two things that I don't think the Ukrainians are using many of. I know they've used some of the JDAM kits that the Israelis are also using, but those are probably things in abundant supply, like the dub bombs and then kits to put on them to make them guided targets. But the artillery shells, I don't think Israel is, using a ton of or anything like that. And that's desperately needed for the Ukrainians. But with the interceptors, this is where I think you're going to get the real conflict there, because if Israel pits fights with Iran, then there's going to be advanced incoming Iranian missiles, not the ones that are necessarily downed by the Iron Dome, like the Hamas and Hezbollah rockets, but the ones that need either the David Sling, the Arrow 2, the Arrow 3, the Patriots, or the THAADs to shoot down, right? These more advanced interceptor systems. And those are the ones that the Ukrainians need as well to shoot down the advanced incoming Russian missiles. And so the U.S. apparently engaged in its largest Patriot missile battle in history when it intercepted 14 Iranian missiles that were aimed at the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. So that was fairly significant. I talked with Martyr Maid Daryl Cooper on my show about this, and he said from his time in the Pentagon, it was policy that for each incoming missile, you would fire 2 interceptors and then 2 more interceptors to ensure that you hit the target. And so that, 4 times 14 is, 56. And so that would be quite the huge number of Patriots that we use there. But we also use some defending Israel, actually in Israel from Iranian missiles. And so, we may have used 100. There's reports that we use 15 to 20% of the total supply of the THAAD, which are the high altitude interceptors. that hit the big incoming Iranian missiles. And so I think that's where you're really going to see what the pecking order is in the U.S. empire, who gets those Patriot interceptors first. And it's important to, note while this is going on for Israel and Ukraine, and it seems like a far more urgent need, the Taiwanese are waiting on these. I know, this is, I think, even before the outbreak of major warfare in Israel, that they weren't expected to get their new Patriot interceptor systems until 2027. Now it's hard to imagine that they would even get them in the coming decade. It's also worth noting that in order to stretch our Patriot supply, the Biden administration actually convinced the Japanese government to change their constitution and allow the Japanese to deploy some of their Patriot interceptors, because Mitsubishi is one of the only companies that makes them outside of the U.S. And so they make Patriots for Japan. And so we've actually transferred some of those Patriots to U.S. bases. That way we have more to send to the Ukrainians. Right, because Japan won't send their weapons directly to a war zone. And so this is like a scheme. So we actually, have to send eventually some of the Patriots from Japan back to the Japanese. And this is just, I think, going to become a real issue in the months ahead, particularly if Israel pits another round of fighting with the Iranians.
Yeah, let's shift to Israel. It seems since October 7th, a lot of things are coming to a head. Ostensibly, Israel has scored certain victories by decapitating a lot of Hezbollah's leadership, and also really getting help from the Turks and the U.S. to topple Assad, and then killing off a good portion of Hamas's leadership. But even then, despite these ostensive wins, these organizations, at least Hamas and Hezbollah, and then also the Houthis as well, they're all more or less intact. And Syria just looks like a mess right now. What is going on with regards to Israel's multi-front wars, and what is the U.S. doing to continue to facilitate that activities?
Yeah, I mean, so there's, I guess, different war zones there. To start off with Hezbollah, I will say, I think Israel seems to have scored a fairly major strategic victory against that group, taking out Hassan Nasrallah and the several other senior members of that leadership. Not only that, they actually got a ceasefire with Hezbollah, where Israel was supposed to leave southern Lebanon, I think 9 months ago now, and supposed to stop bombing southern Lebanon. And they haven't. They're carrying out daily, if not multiple airstrikes a day in southern Lebanon. They keep advancing their troops and taking more territory, not giving it back. And so Hezbollah isn't fighting back. And so that does seem significant to me, and like a real blow to whatever you want to call it, the axis of resistance or not, but the groups in the region that resist what Israel is doing in its expansionist project. I mean, they seem to have scored a real victory against Hezbollah. Now, it could be short-lived, right? At any point, Hezbollah could go back to war with Israel and kick them out of southern Lebanon. And if that happens, then, I guess I have to change my analysis. But at this point in time, it seems like Israel in some ways has beaten Hezbollah. And also Bashar al-Assad in Syria has been beaten. And that, of course, happened in November of last year. And that has allowed Israel to take a large swath of southern Syria. Now, I don't know. Israel isn't a massive country. And so to have troops occupying southern Lebanon and southern Syria, and the Air Force capability to strike both of those countries so frequently, I mean, that has to be a strain with everything going on with Iran and Yemen and the Palestinians that we'll get to next. But Netanyahu does seem to have the ability to take and hold territory right now in southern Syria and southern Lebanon. And this seems like a real expansion of the greater Israel project. I guess next I would turn my attention to Hamas and Gaza, where while Israel has, just like with Hezbollah, taken out a large part of Hamas's leadership, it's worth noting that Hezbollah is continuing to fight and continuing to inflict blows on the Israelis. I mean, they're not launching rockets out of Gaza into southern Israel, but a part of that is because they don't have to, because the Israelis are in their streets for them to fight against and for them to kill. And in recent weeks, we've seen several attacks leave Israeli soldiers dead. They continue to host some hostages and at least the ability to continue to negotiate with the Israelis. I mean, this is somewhat significant that Hamas still is operating in Gaza in the capacity that they're operating. And now
so is it true that Hamas, according to some reports, has actually kind of reconstituted itself despite initial degradation? Because I've heard conflicting reports about that, intelligence reports.
Yeah, so I've read from U.S. and Israeli intelligence sources. It was somebody in the Israeli opposition, maybe Benny Gantz, who or Yair Lapid, who brought this forward. Then Blinken and somebody in the Trump administration said it as well, that prior to the fighting, there were about 40,000 militants in Gaza split between Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and maybe some smaller groups. And now Hamas has an estimated 40,000 fighters.
Wow.
Now, I think there's some argument that, while they still have the same number of personnel, they lack this capacity, the guns, the rockets for all of those. And so you could argue that, their ability to launch rockets into southern Israel has been degraded. That being said, if Israel stopped fighting today, there are, and this has been admitted by Israeli sources, this is where I got this from, thousands of munitions laying across Gaza that are unexploded. And prior to October 7th, 80% of Hamas's weaponry was made up of, dud Israeli bombs that had landed in the strip over the years, that's broken down by Hamas, made into rockets and other munitions, and used against Israel. And so I think, in a sense, one of the reasons that Israel probably feels that they have to remove the Palestinians from Gaza is that if they don't, whether it's Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or whatever other resistance faction emerges in Gaza, they are going to have an ample amount of weaponry at their disposal. And so I think, it's far different to say that Hamas is in a similar position to Hezbollah, even if they've lost leadership and their new recruits aren't quite as well trained or equipped as they were before. They're still able to resist. And if given the space, they would probably resist maybe even harder than they did before with all the spent munition or unexploded munitions they can now fire back at the Israelis.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because also what I've read about Hezbollah too, because it's also a political party and it operates in a really fractured political system that apparently now has like a president in Lebanon that's more or less like a puppet of like the NATO Israel axis, and that there's always like that threat of the Lebanese army actually launching like a civil war against Hezbollah to keep it tamed. I've even heard rumors too that with Syria now more or less aligned with the U.S. Israeli like imperium. But there have been like, I've heard some rumblings of like the threatening the use of Sunni jihadists to go into Lebanon as well to go to war with Hezbollah. They're in many ways very boxed in, not just like militarily but also politically too. But yeah, with Hamas, it definitely gets more complicated there. And that it has all the hallmarks of a perpetual war, but it seems to me that there's something coming to a head there where Israel is going for like the accelerationist option of not just like trying to like expel Hamas, but really starve all of Gaza, exterminate a lot of it, and whatever is left of it is just going to be displaced or resettled. Where do you think things are heading there?
Yeah, I think exactly what you said. So early in the war, I explain all this. The Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister is a man named Ron Dermer. He was born in Miami. He's now a member of the Israeli Knesset, and he is one of the closest allies and confidants of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He is also right now a frequent traveler in the White House. This is what reported in Reuters that Ron Dermer is there all the time. And so after October 7th, Netanyahu tasked Dermer to come up with a plan for Gaza. And the problem that the Israelis had is there was nowhere to send the Palestinians, and the Palestinians didn't want to leave. And Americans will typically hear the argument that the Egyptians, the Jordanians, or whatever other country doesn't want to take in the Palestinians as a negative reflection on the Palestinians, that this is somehow like equivalent to the Americans not wanting large numbers of Latin American migrants to come into the United States. This is, they're like poor burdens on the system and things like that is, I think, how Americans look at it. But that's not what the issue is. The issue is that if these countries take in the Palestinians, it will be seen by the population. It's not like, I don't think that General al-Sisi or King Abdallah necessarily cares about the Palestinians. However, the people of those countries do. And if you take in the Palestinians, you're enabling Israel's genocide.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be able to do this if there wasn't a willing third country to take in the Palestinians.
Yeah. And I would also add too that this creates like another problem because of the fact that you have like a really riled up populations in Egypt and Jordan. You pretty much erase all of Israel's strategic and political gains because you may get like an Islamist government that topples and destabilizes those respective governments as well because of the backlash that are all going to be automatically hostile towards Israel. And doing that, you could get that type of blowback as well. And that's why some of these countries historically, like even like Jordan and Lebanon, were loath to take in Palestinians because of the fact of like reprisals from not just like Palestinian militants that are embedded there, but also from like the population that has also gotten angry because all these countries are hanging on by a thread through like literal U.S. foreign aid bribes and all of that to keep those regimes pacified.
Yeah, well, I guess I would just make the point that I don't think Israel is too concerned about Islamist governments in the region. I mean, for years, they, brought about the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, who was predictably replaced by a jihadist government. Everybody knew that your options for Syria post the fall of the Islamic State were Bashar al-Assad or Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, and the Israelis, the Americans, the Turks were pretty clear that they preferred Jolani to Bashar al-Assad, even if, he was politically abusive, but not necessarily secularly. And that's why, since Jolani has taken over, you've seen the massacres of the Druze and the Alawites, and even some in the Israeli government raising the flag and saying, hey, we're concerned about that. I think particularly if the Jordanians went Islamist, the Israelis would see it probably as an opportunity, just like they did in Syria, to move in, bomb military bases, and take territory. Egypt is a much bigger, bite to swallow, say, it's a much larger country and probably a much larger military with, I think, military commanders that are probably more independent in the Muslim Brotherhood, but it's certainly what the Jordanians, I don't think the Israelis would mind seeing as Islamist government sweep in. But aside from that, back to the Dermer plan. So Dermer's solution to this plan was to make conditions in Gaza so horrific for the Palestinians that, people would see it as an act of charity to take in the Palestinians, even if it meant their ethnic cleansing. And I think a part of that would come from the Palestinians being so desperate that they would be willing to leave. I read this article today that's in 972 magazine, which is an Israeli outlet.
That's a really great outlet. Yes.
Yeah. But it was by a Gazan woman who was just describing how everywhere you look is emaciated people who are getting dizzy and fainting in the streets. They're fighting over food. The children are all malnourished. And so the Israelis are giving the Palestinians a situation. You either watch your children starve to death in front of your eyes, or you decide to leave Gaza. And so I think you're going to see, more and more Palestinians being willing to leave. Now, I think there's like kind of a third step to all of this, and that is the Egyptians and the Jordanians are not going to be expected to split the Palestinian population. I think they're going to try to spread them out over a large swath of Africa and the Middle East and potentially even Southeast Asia. They've talked about Indonesia taking in. Yeah. And so you have the U.S. empire, which has a lot of influence to throw around, and a lot of countries in the region that are absolutely desperate. We know that the Americans have approached the Congo, Rwanda, Somalia, but not only just the government in Mogadishu, but also
Somaliland. Yeah. I was going to ask you about that.
And Puntland, and both governments in Libya, both the Haftar and the Tripoli government, as well as the Sudanese. And one of the things and the Syrians, and one of the things to recognize about all these countries is that they could really, really benefit from doing the Americans a favor. For Puntland and Somaliland, they could be looking at getting independence from Washington. Mogadishu is possibly going to fall to Al-Shabaab. The Dave DeCamp at Antiwar.com has a new report out about how the Somali government is literally melting away in front of the Al-Shabaab offensive. And Syria, they want and have had sanctions lifted. They're certainly in need of American recognition and support moving forward. And so when you start to look at all these different countries in all these different areas, and the amount of Palestinians that the Israelis are killing or already killed in Gaza, which is likely in the hundreds of thousands, you could really just be talking about 100 or 1,000 so Palestinians ending up in each one of these different countries. Now, I think this has kind of a two-pronged effect. One, it makes it more tolerable for each country taking in the Palestinians, but two, it erases the Palestinian people far quicker than otherwise would. Yes. There's 2 million Palestinians living in the Sinai Peninsula in a refugee city. It's very easy for them to develop a culture on one day returning to Gaza. And I think this will lead to more Palestinian resistance and maybe attacks inside of Israel, probably terrorism and things like that. But if the Palestinian community is divided and fragmented over many countries, vast areas where people really can't travel and see each other, and also where there's not a lot of prosperity or opportunities anyways, right? Going to Sudan in the middle of a civil war, going to Somalia, going to Libya, which is a failed state, Syria, which is ruled by jihadists, then the Palestinians will just be bent on survival, which will likely mean integration into society and giving up their Palestinian identity. And so just understand how nefarious this all is. Like, they are trying to erase a historic culture and people from the face of the earth so Israel could claim all the territory that they want.
How much credence do you lend to some of the speculation that Palestinians could be resettled in European countries as well?
If they came up with this policy, maybe they would send small numbers of Palestinians to different European countries. The Palestinians in Gaza are highly educated people. Throughout the years, there's been, different European efforts to build schools and hospitals and medical programs. A lot of European doctors have traveled to Gaza and have relationships with Palestinians there. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, a total of in the tens of thousands of Palestinians do end up maybe using if you're going to leave Palestine and your options are Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Libya, and let's say a doctor in the UK and you maybe try to get him to help you petition to be allowed into that country, and you're able to bring your family to the UK over any of those places, that's probably what I would do for the benefit of my family, to be honest. So my guess is that you would have a number of Palestinians either, for like token charitable reasons for Europeans to do, or because these people have connections to European countries. You would see a number of Palestinians go, but not in a significant number and not in the same population transfer kind of way that you would see to the African or Middle Eastern nations.
Yes. Let's shift to Iran. This has multiple facets. It almost seems to me, despite like the end of the 12-day war, there was like an uneasy cessation of conflict for now, but I get the suspicion that things will pop off eventually in a matter of months or so. Where do you see things going between Israel and Iran? Do you think that there is a really strong chance of a direct conflict between the two countries resuming?
Yeah. And I think this is Donald Trump's fault. And one of the other trends of Donald Trump's first administration wasn't just his inability to get a deal done with Vladimir Putin, but was his inability to get a deal done with the North Koreans and Kim Jong-un. And I think we're going to see a similar thing here on the Iran issue where, again, it takes time, many months, to hammer out one of these deals. They were apparently making real progress during the first 5 rounds of talks. Ted Snyder has a fantastic article out today at the American Conservative. He's one of our columnists at Antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, where he lays out that the Iranians were optimistic and willing to engage in some concessions on their nuclear enrichment program before Israel started bombing Iran. And so I think that shows kind of 2 very important things. One, Israel would scuttle talks if we are getting close to talks, and Donald Trump won't blame the Israelis for that. But 2, Trump just doesn't have the attention span to see one of these deals through. And, we probably were, the negotiations would still be ongoing. We still wouldn't have had Trump sit down with the Iranian president and sign the deal and shake hands yet. There's going to be technical details to be worked out. They're talking about, a nuclear enrichment consortium, which takes, the involvement and consent of the Emirati and Saudi governments as well. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and this is going to be complicated. The JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was negotiated under Obama, took years to hammer out. And so because of the long timeline to get a deal done, just because of diplomatic bureaucracy that I'm sure exists in Iran, but probably far more in the United States, and Trump's inability to see one of these deals done through to completion, I think guarantees that a deal isn't going to get done. Now, that really shouldn't be an issue, Jose, because Iran isn't trying to build a nuclear weapon still, right? And so we don't have to do anything about Iran's nuclear program. But Trump keeps saying that we're going to bomb Iran and do something if they don't make a deal. And so that necessarily wouldn't even be a major issue, because I think Trump has a lot of threats and bluster and things like that. I think the problem is that the Israelis take that as a green light to go ahead and attack Iran, right? When was it that the Israelis attacked Iran? On the 60-day deadline that Trump had given. And Trump was like, it was day 61. The Iranians should have seen this coming. They should have negotiated a deal faster. When, no, Trump, you should have told Netanyahu that he's not going to use his American planes to drop American bombs that were all paid for by the United States of America. They're just flown by Israeli pilots with Star of David flag stickers taped over the American ones. That we're not going to allow you to do that to Iran and start a war with the Iranians when we're on the precipice of getting a deal done. But Donald Trump didn't do that. And it's because that's who Donald Trump is. He's not strong enough to stand up to the Israelis. Or I do worry that, especially when you have people like Mike Huckabee around you, that Donald Trump really has some religious outlook here and thinks that he is in some way like kind of divinely being a part of, you know, how the Christian faith is supposed to move forward. You know what I'm saying? Like the rebuilding of the third temple. As absurd as all this sounds, I think there's maybe two things that contribute to. One, Mike Huckabee is very good at selling on this. And, you know, he's talking about how God saved his life to do this. And also, Donald Trump almost had his head blown off in front of a crowd full of people and was saved by a couple centimeters, you know, apparently him turning his head at his last moment. And I would admit, like, mandate. Right. And, you know, he's just a man, right? I would imagine if I were that close to being killed, that it would significantly change the way I thought. And for somebody like Trump, who already has some narcissistic tendencies, to take that, to think that it was like divine intervention that saved his life so he could do something, and then his ambassador to Israel is saying that something is to be a part of furthering the state of Israel, which is, of course, about tearing down the Al-Aqsa Mosque, rebuilding the third temple on the Temple Mount, ushering in the return of the Messiah, and you know there's people in Israel, right, that are actually it's preparing for the sacrifice of the red heifer and all kinds of crazy shit like that going on. I mean, you know, there's some real like kind of crazy divine inspiration that's taking place, and I think driving a part of Trump's Israel policy here.
One of the more just shocking kind of like sub stories, if you will, during this whole Iran-Israel conflict, and also inevitably like the U.S. as well, is like the reported penetration of the International Atomic Energy Agency by Israeli and Western intelligence communities. Do you know what that is all about and what implications that has for like Iran's willingness to get back into into negotiations about nuclear topics?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not a subject that I know a ton about. I do remember when the former head of the IAEA, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he had done a lot of good work in putting out reports and making it explicitly clear that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, was not trying to build a nuclear weapon, and was 100% complying with the terms of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated under Obama, that was crucial to preventing an outbreak of war between Iran and Israel and the U.S. When he died, the Rafael Grossi ended up in his position at the lobby, and you know he was the Western selected candidate to be in that job, and the U.S. empire doesn't do those kinds of things unintentionally, right? We've manipulated particularly the Organization on the Prohibition for Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, and you know during the Bush administration in particular, there was a lot of intervention there and threats made against the head of that agency to try to get them to quell reports that would have thrown cold water on the WMD hopes for the Iraq War, but also during the Trump administration, I think there was significantly more intervention. And this is really when the U.S. empire hijacked the OPCW in order to fabricate information or cook reports or distort information in order to make it look like Assad was using chemical weapons to justify U.S. airstrikes on Syria. And of course, Aramate has done some really good journalism on that. So that's kind of, I guess, my thinking on it is the U.S. and the Europeans pit this guy for a reason, and look what they did to the OPCW, which would make me think that they did use information from the IAEA in order to carry out these strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. And that is going to be a problem going forward for the Iranians. I'm just not sure how big of a problem it's going, like if they're going to let that prevent a new nuclear deal from happening. I don't know.
Yeah, one final point before we leave. I think we see in foreign policy, especially with like the US's very aggressive foreign policy conjunction with Israel, that this constant escalation against Iran may turn their greatest and like unfounded fears of Iran getting a nuke into almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, if they just continue saber rattling and even carrying out kinetic strikes. Do you think that the more the U.S. and Israel start continue attacking Iran directly, that Iran may be faced with no choice but to consider a nuclear program? Because they're looking at just like the Libya situation, Iraq as well, and then like contrast that to North Korea, which has a nuclear arsenal. It's thus far not been able, like there have not been any direct attacks launched against it.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I always consider is I try to put myself in the position of a military advisor to a foreign president, and what would I say? And for over a year now, I have made the point that if I were advising the Iranian mullahs and I was telling them what path to take, I would say, you know, our country has two pathways. The pathway that Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi took, and look at what happened to Iraq and Libya, or the path that Kim Jong-un took, and look at, you know, how fat and happy and healthy that little guy is. And so you kind of have, you know, those are your options. Like, choose wisely, but I think it's very obvious that the only way to prevent regime change in Tehran is a Iranian nuclear weapon. Now, you know, I'm an anti-war activist. I don't think that nuclear proliferation is necessarily a good thing. I just don't see how the Iranian government is, especially after the Israeli and US strikes, is calculating anything but the way to save our country is to develop a nuclear weapon. And so I'm not sure what the Iranian plan is to make that happen. But I would imagine that those discussions are happening in Tehran all the time, and we're moving closer and closer to the day that the Iranians decide that we are, you know, going to forego our religious fatwa, which has kept us from developing nuclear weapons for over 2 decades. And, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of people in Iran who made the point that, you know, in 2006 or 7, when the Americans were really bogged down in Iraq and the North Koreans broke out and developed a nuclear weapon because they knew that the Americans were too busy to stop them, we should have done the same thing then and would prevent a lot of headache, a lot of needless killing in Iran. And we've allowed this to happen to our country. And so now we have to reverse course and become far more hardline and militaristic. And look, Jose, I think it's, you know, probably a lesson not only being learned in Tehran, but in Caracas, in Havana, in Beijing, and in countries all over the world that are not firmly entrenched in the American empire, that, you know, basically the only safe way to prevent regime change in your country is to have a robust nuclear program, and also to not make concessions to Washington, because Washington doesn't operate in good faith. Right. If you make a concession, we're just going to ask for more. You know, there is no reasonable deal that you can make. Any reasonable deal, any concession that you make will just be seen as like a token. And then we're just going to say, okay, well, now the negotiating position is you have less than you did before. So now you're going to have to give up even more. This is the policy of Washington that's going to prevent any country from ever being interested in negotiating with the United States ever again.
Well, that's a dour note to end off on, but sober analysis is always that you provide, Kyle. So, yeah, before you leave, Kyle, let the audience know where they can keep up with your latest projects.
Yeah, so of course the Libertarian Institute is where I publish and do most of my work. I know you frequently have your articles on that website as well. And most of the time I run them as viewpoints at antiwar.com because I'm the opinion editor there. I host two shows, Conflicts of Interest and the Kyle Anzalone Show, which, Jose, you've been one of my great guests on that program. And I also do some writing at judgenap.com as well.
Fantastic. Well, that is all. That is it for this episode of Headline Geopolitics. And if you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with anyone who's just skeptical of the current foreign policy establishment narratives. And until next time, I'm José Niño, and we will see you on the next installment of Headline Geopolitics.